Good morning, everyone. Welcome to welcome to the MEI newly renovated headquarters building here on N Street, and we're very pleased to have this opportunity to meet today and to discuss an important issue of trade, development, and security, possibility of an FTA between the United States and Egypt, and the focus of the conversation is a report on trade, reform, and revitalization toward a U.S.-Egypt free trade agreement, which is the work of our very own Mirette Mabrouk. It is available online at the MEI website, and we invite you all to download it and take a look at the full report. But we're very pleased to have with us today to discuss this report Mirette, the author of the study, along with Hisham Fahmy, the CEO of AmCham Egypt and Inc. And Deborah Lehr, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Basilinna and also a member of our board. We do welcome audience participation, your questions, and in order to ask a question of the panel, we ask everybody to download, or not to download, but to go to the www.menti.com website, and you should use the code 996507. You will be able to ask your questions, and I will we have some levity on the panel, but that's okay. It's early in the morning. We will be able to see your questions and get them into the panel for discussion. But let me begin by inviting Mirette to talk a little bit about the study and her reasons for believing that now is the right time for a U.S.-Egypt free trade agreement.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Is my mic on?
Yes.
Thank you. So thank you all so much for coming this morning. I know it's early in the morning and we do appreciate your time. A U.S.-Egypt free trade agreement has been a topic of conversation and discussion for at least 20 years that I'm aware of. And the conversations keep stalling for various reasons. Many of them are in the paper. The paper is online. Do please take a look at it. But many of the issues were to do with requests that the U.S. had, mostly to do with intellectual property rights, human rights, labor rights, freedom of movement, trafficking, child labor, and many of them Egypt did not want to address. So those talks have continued to stall over the past 20 years. The thing is, free trade agreements are inherently political animals. They're not necessarily about the economics. There have been slight shifts in movement that would indicate that now may be a better time to discuss free trade agreements. And I think one of the things that makes it interesting is the questions have not changed. The demands on the US side or on the Egyptian side have not changed, although there has been considerable movement on the Egyptian side to try and sort of meet in the middle. However, what the report suggests is that one way to move forward might be to take a look at the nature of the FTA, which is that we don't look at a shallow FTA, which has to do with borders and regulations and standards, but we look at a deep integration FTA. And a deep integration FTA involves labor reform, involves judicial reform, involves freedom of movement. It involves a great many things that are already on the ask as far as the US is concerned. But instead of Egypt being forced to make them, the idea is that it would be better for Egypt's economy to make them anyway, because it would. As you know, well, I don't want to talk for too long, but it is integral to the growth of Egypt's economy that some of these developments take place anyway. And on the plainly economic side, it's an easy sell. Egypt is already home to well over 35% of US investment in Africa, over 46% of US investment in the Middle East, I think. The new energy finds are poised to make it an energy hub, not an energy exporter. People make that mistake, but an energy hub. And for various other political reasons, again, I don't want to go on, it may be a better time, assuming that everybody gets their ducks in a row. Thanks.
Thank you, Mirette. And Hisham, turning to you, and if you would provide a perspective of the Egyptian business community and how business people in Egypt would perceive a free trade agreement. I mean, on the face of it, one would assume that it would be seen as a positive element, although, as Mirette suggested, it may also come with some, expectations about political and economic reforms in Egypt that could affect the business climate, could affect the way people do business there. So what do you think the business community in Egypt is thinking about an FTA?
Well, thank you, Jerry. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. Thank you, Mirette, Deborah, for being here. As Mirette said, Egypt has wanted a free trade agreement, but the U.S. didn't want it. And then the U.S. wanted a free trade agreement. Egypt didn't want it. So the odds are that one day they're going to both come on the same page.
Which could be neither side wants it.
Yeah, exactly. And Mirette said this has been around for 20 years. I always say I've been talking about a free trade agreement here since I've had hair. So, and it's been a long time. The private sector is for a free trade agreement with the United States. And we really have been pushing for it as companies, as institutions, as individuals. We believe an FTA is it's an end to itself, but we know that an FTA with the United States will take a long time. We think, though, that the negotiations themselves will be very important. Actually taking the chapters of each part of an FTA negotiation will have a big impact. It will be a catalyst for change. It will be a catalyst for reform. It should cement the reforms that actually have been taken in the last 5 years, economic reforms, and push further for other reforms. So from that point of view, I think an FTA is important. I can go on a bit, but let me stop there and then continue on other reasons.
Okay. Thank you, Hisham. And Deborah, same question to you, really, from a U.S. private sector perspective. Is this the right time for an FTA? Will American business see an FTA with Egypt as an opportunity? Will it attract more investment from the United States into Egypt? And is that something that people are looking for right now?
Well, again, let me just echo my thanks for joining us first thing in the morning. We know you have plenty of things that you can be doing with your time, so we're appreciative that you're here to talk about what I think is a very important subject. And just to echo what Mirette said, these agreements are political. They send a certain symbolism in negotiating them, and we see more and more of these types of bilateral agreements happening now, with a sense that things like the World Trade Organization aren't necessarily living up to expectations. And so many countries, whether it's Russia or China or the United States, the European Union, are resorting to bilateral agreements. For the United States, our standards tend to be the highest. And why? Because we're pushing for countries to take the kind of steps to allow our companies to succeed. So the kinds of requirements that we ask in our free trade agreements are the kinds of requirements that American companies need or want to see, whether it's transparency in the rule of law, consistency of tariffs at the border, that they can't be negotiated with customs, that it's clear what the application process is if you're going to set up a company, and you don't have to go to many different bureaucracies and get many different passes. And with an economy growing at the rate that Egypt is, and with the political stability that has come, it's a very attractive market. But if you look at a lot of the companies who are there now, they tend to be some of obviously our large multinational corporations, but who have Egyptian partners who are helping them on the ground. It's not necessarily that we're seeing cutting edge US companies, the leaders of growth here who are coming in. We're not seeing some of the tech companies. We're not seeing others who are drivers of growth and production. We see what tends to be more of traditional industries, apparel, and those kinds of things that are there, agriculture, oil and gas. If Egypt wants to diversify, then it needs to take these kinds of steps that come with a free trade agreement. And sometimes outside pressure helps, because it's very hard to bring about the kinds of, I think, what would be very politically difficult steps for the Egyptian government to take in order to pass this kind of free trade agreement. And ultimately, quite honestly, it's probably American companies who are going to benefit most in the beginning if there is an FTA, because of the access that they're going to get. And right now, many of the types of exports that are coming to the United States from Egypt come in at very low duties. I mean, even overall, our average tariff rate is a little over 1%. Egypt's is over 8%. So if we see those reductions, it's going to act in U.S. companies' benefit. But in the longer term, it really is, as Mirette was saying, the steps that we ask are good for Egypt. They're the kinds of things that will allow the economy to grow. If you open certain sectors, we're going to start to see job creation, additional foreign direct investment. And these are the kinds of steps that Egypt needs to take, whether it's through an FTA or not.
So Deborah, if I can stay with you for a moment, you also have vast experience in dealing with US-China trade. And if you could talk for a little bit in terms of the kinds of adjustments that you're talking about in the Egyptian business environment, compared to some of the stresses and strains that we have right now in our bilateral trade relationships with China. How can we avoid those issues? What kinds of things would we think about in order to ensure that as we go forward with Egypt, we don't encounter the same kinds of problems?
Yeah, well, as everybody reads in the headlines, obviously these negotiations are very complicated with China, and quite honestly, when we were doing the negotiations in the 1990s with China, we were faced with many of the same issues that Egypt is facing. The challenge we have with China today is the agreements that we're talking about really aren't just about trade, they're really about future dominance and technology. And so it's really a fight over who has the preeminent economy, and in many ways, who has the preeminent model for growth. And I think as Egypt looks at its own model, it in some ways is closer to a Chinese model in certain ways, with almost a one-party system. It has benefits in ability to make decisions, but also is a little more complicated in terms of loosening control on the economy. I would say we work with Chinese companies who've been looking at the opportunities in Egypt, and some of the concerns that they voice, and I think it's been that the politics in many ways, and I know Xi Jinping has been there, President Sisi's been to China twice, and that mostly it's state-owned enterprises who are coming in because the Chinese private sector is very concerned about what the opportunities, how difficult it is to do business there, and that they are concerned about political stability. Part of it, I think, is raising awareness that Egypt has changed. Egypt's open for business. They're going through reforms, but I think only it's going to take a little time for that understanding to sink in for Chinese companies.
Thank you. And Mirette, one of the points that you make in the study, of course, is that not only the United States, but or the West in general, but also the Chinese, the Russians, others are very interested in expanding their relationship with China. The Chinese certainly see opportunities.
Yeah.
There is already fairly significant Chinese investment in Egypt, and so I guess the question would be, if you're the Egyptians and if the United States, in order to finalize an FTA, is putting fairly high requirements into the agreement, is this something that is still going to be attractive to Egypt, or might they say, well, we have the Chinese who aren't asking us for these things, we have the Russians who aren't asking us for these things, why should we bother with the United States?
Okay. It's a really good question. The thing is, Egypt does bother with the United States. If I can use a Chinese metaphor for an American thing, the US is first son, always will be. That doesn't mean that Egypt isn't super interested in working with the Chinese. I think the president inked 5 separate economic cooperation agreements with the Chinese last year. And for the US not going through with an FTA, it carries an opportunity cost. The EU agreement that with Egypt that's been in force for well over 10 years now. It's been so successful. It's double trade between the EU and Egypt, and it was so successful that they set up a new agreement just for agricultural and processed agricultural goods. And Russia, the relationship with Russia is slightly different. It's always a slower, smaller market. But the US market is a huge one, an attractive one, and it carries a cachet. So there is an opportunity cost there. But Egypt can't afford to sit around and sort of wait to be asked to dance. However, having said that, Egypt has never responded particularly well to pressure. The carrot and stick approach, it doesn't work with Egypt, but it does respond well to incentive. And I think in the case of the US, the last 20 years haven't borne particular fruit saying you need to do this. The US is not under any obligations to do anything. It's not. But it can say, hello, these are the terms. Totally up to you. And it is, in my opinion, for various reasons which we can discuss later, it is in Egypt's interest to undertake many of these reforms because they are integral to the kind of growth that Egypt needs. All right, because macroeconomic indicators don't always show the big picture. Does that help?
And just to remind.
Oh, I didn't have my coffee. So that's why I'm quiet.
Just to remind everyone, if you want to ask a question, www.menti.com using the code that's on your handouts, and please go ahead and you can ask a question anytime. But let me ask a question of Hisham. We heard from Mirette and from Deborah about the attractiveness, perhaps, for the Egyptian private sector for economic diversification, that an FTA with the U.S. may open the door for different kinds of development in Egypt, perhaps the beginning of a tech sector or other kinds of job creating production. What is the attitude of the business community there? Are they looking for those kinds of opportunities? Do they see that there are areas of development that are closed off to them, that they might be able to use an FTA to exploit?
Yeah, let me also go back to a couple of things that were said before. As Mirette mentioned, Egypt does have an association agreement with the European Union, and it's 11 years now. And quite honestly, Europe has made a real advancement in Egypt. The Egyptian private sector and public sector have adopted and adapted a lot of the European standards and way of doing business, and they actually have twinning agreements with different institutions. European standards, we're having problems getting US standards adopted in Egypt because what Europe is doing and so on. So we're facing an uphill battle. I mean, it's not just the Chinese. The Chinese, as they're just coming in, they've signed agreements, but not a lot has been done.
Yeah.
I didn't know the Chinese had private sector, by the way, but anyway.
They do. It's also how you define it.
As far as the companies that are in Egypt, as you said, Mirette, are the big companies, the Procter & Gamble's, the oil and gas, the Apaches, the ExxonMobils, etc. But very recently, as Egypt says, we're trying to digitize. We've got companies that have come in, like Google, like Facebook. MasterCard is working hard on digitization of the economy. Honeywell is doing smart cities and so on. So the tech economy is taking part of Egypt's current growth and so on. For Egyptian companies, of course, opening a market like the US is incredibly attractive. Investments, if there is a free trade agreement or even starting the negotiations, American companies, and we're quite honestly, what we're looking for, as you said, the big companies are there. They know how to do business. They know how to go around the Egyptian bureaucracy. But who are we targeting, or we want in Egypt now, is the second layer of American companies. Not the 500, but maybe in the 1,000. And they're hesitant. They still don't know what it is. If we have a free trade agreement, or we have negotiation of a free trade agreement, that will give them incentives to look at Egypt, to look at what's, and their opportunities are there, my goodness. And then Egyptian companies, American companies coming in, what do they bring? Investment, employment, innovation, management systems, technology, leapfrogging technology for things that Egypt needs. So Egypt needs this. And I think American companies, they're not the big ones, need it to come to Egypt. They don't know it yet, but I'm going to stop here.
So Mirette, Hisham raised a point that there is already an agreement between the EU and Egypt. I guess the question is, to what extent can we look to our allies in Europe, the UK, which conceivably will be looking for a free trade agreement itself with Egypt relatively soon, the EU. To what extent can we anticipate that they would support the kind of political and economic reforms in Egypt that we would be looking for in an FTA? Will they be willing to back us up? Or are they going to say, United States, happy to hold your coat, and we're going to continue doing business just the way we're doing it right now?
It's a great question, but I think we already have our answer. The agreement has been in place for the last 11 years, so clearly the requirements are not the same. You mentioned the British. They've actually been working for the last 2 years on trying to get a separate agreement with Egypt, I think, because as soon as they saw Brexit thundering down the road, they're desperately trying to cover their points. But Hisham made a really, really important point. Egypt's macro indicators have been really good. The reform, they've made some very, very difficult decisions. The reforms have mostly been right on the nose. The macro indicators are really good. But for example, CAPMAS recently released its, this report is released every 4 years. Poverty has gone up again. Now, to be fair, that's not indicative to this government. Poverty has been going up steadily for the past 30 years. It's almost doubled in the last 20. But the problem is, even when the macro indicators look good, even when Egypt's macro indicators were fantastic in the early 2000s, the problem is that kind of growth comes from large capital-intensive and energy-intensive industries like oil and gas that, traditionally speaking, don't employ that many people. So the problem here is the sectoral composition of the growth. Industries which have also grown exponentially in Egypt, like telecommunications and banking, those again don't employ as many people as one would need. People often talk about the informal sector in Egypt. The last good report I read is almost 10 years old, and I think that indicated that over 90% of younger people, i.e. under age 35, were involved in the informal sector. And a good quarter of people working are involved in what they call vulnerable employment, which means that they're largely self-employed and don't have things like health insurance and social insurance. So the sectoral composition is one problem. The other problem is the distribution of wealth. Egypt, traditionally speaking, has had difficulty collecting taxes. The taxes to GDP ratio has been on the lower end. So the government has had to resort to either austerity or taxes based on consumption, like VAT. That tends to adversely impact people on the lower end of the spectrum. So even though the macro indicators are good and they deserve credit for them, they're going to need to look at, the structural reforms need work. They're going to need to look at where that money is going, how wealth is distributed, and how to support them. It's significant. And jobs like the ones that Hisham mentioned, tech jobs, jobs that require education, that require technology that can then be exported, are fantastic for boosting poverty indicators. And Egypt is still working on those. And FTA, I think, would be fantastic for things like that.
Thank you. And so, Deborah, one of the things that Mirette talks about in her report is this idea not only that investment in Egypt as a bilateral aspect of economic development would be a positive thing, but that Egypt as a hub for reaching particularly into Africa, that I think your anecdote was that Cairo was ranked as a better place to do business on the African continent, number one. I think Johannesburg was number two. And so if American business is looking at Egypt as a possible place for investment, to what extent do you think that they would look at it in terms of its ability to reach south into the African continent?
I think certainly Egypt is very important as a hub. going in. And as we see the growth in Africa, it's becoming much more appealing for American companies. And, just contrasting it with China, certainly China has recognized both Egypt's role in that and the opportunities that are happening in Africa. And there's a lot of competition for U.S. companies now coming in because of that. But with Egypt, certainly it's appealing that you get access to the Middle East, and you get access then North Africa, which is continuing to grow. And we do have some free trade agreements there already, and they have been to the benefit, both politically and economically, of American companies. If we look at the relationships that we have with Morocco, for example. And then how we continue to find ways to access sort of the rest of Africa, which is challenging for American companies because some of the ways of doing business there are ways that are not in practice acceptable or even legally allowable in the US. And so to try and compete can be very complicated for our companies, and we can be at a disadvantage. And so having these kinds of FTAs that bring a certain legal structure as well and try and change not only what the policy and the legal system is, but the practice. Because in many ways, it's not just about having the legal, like there can be a published tariff rate in Egypt, but the practice may be perhaps that you can negotiate what that tariff rate is at the border, and depending on who the customs official is. And if that's an acceptable practice, that's putting American companies at a disadvantage. But if we've negotiated away a lot of those tariffs, then there's a lot of benefit, and it's, as Hisham was saying, I think even more appealing for those companies who aren't as experienced in exporting or investing internationally.
Hisham, did you want to add?
Yes, I'm very excited because at last the U.S. has realized that Egypt is in Africa, and only recently they've been talking about Egypt and Africa. And I always take this map with me whenever I go, especially in Congress, and say, oh, look, here's Africa, here's Egypt, this is Africa, and so on. And in the last few years, quite a few years, Egypt has had trade agreements with African countries, like the COMESA, for instance. And this example I'm going to give is few years ago, and I'm not sure it's still happening. For instance, Heinz tomato ketchup. They've exported the seeds for the tomatoes to Egypt, so export from the U.S. They planted in Egypt. They made the ketchup in Egypt, and then they exported it to the COMESA at zero tariff. Now, if Heinz wanted to export from the United States, they would pay 40%. So this is how Egypt can become a hub for American companies going into Africa. And the free trade agreements in Africa are increasing. There's now the continental, what's it called? African Continental Trade, FTA.
Yes.
Already, I think 19 or 20 countries
27.
have 27, so it's actually in effect. Some of them have to ratify it. So this will bring a huge amount of African countries together. And as Deborah says, Egypt can be the hub for investments, of American investments in Africa through Egypt and so on. And as she said also, Egypt has a Arab free trade agreement. It has a European Association agreement. So even American companies in Egypt can go anywhere, south, north, east, west. So I think it's good for American companies, and it's good for Egyptian companies who will be working with those American companies. And back to Mirette about industries that employ a lot of people. Tourism. Last, 2 weeks ago, CAPMAS announced that Egyptian tourism revenues are now the largest ever in history. Not in numbers, but in revenue. And a huge number of people work in the tourism industry. Keep our fingers crossed that stays.
Mirette, I have a question from the audience that I'll put to you, although Deborah and Hisham also welcome. You mentioned that sometimes FTAs are about politics, not economics. As Russia bolsters its investments in Egypt, do you think this may act as an impetus for the U.S. to refine/waive FTA requirements?
Well, if you read the paper, my suggestion would be that this is something that the US ought to take into consideration. Like I said, there is an opportunity cost. I think I don't work for the US government, but at some point they're going to say this we can accept and this we might not accept. Certainly, I tend to find that competition does tend to speed things up, but it may be that at the moment there isn't enough impetus. The U.S. because also when you say the U.S. there's businesses, there's the Department of Commerce, there's the State Department, there's a military. I mean, it's a huge, it's a huge issue, and I think that generally speaking, the points of contention between the two countries have usually stopped at the State Department because the State Department has a list of things that it needs to see get done. So the short answer to the question was it probably should, but there is no guarantee that it will.
Well, and let me go on. There, we have a second question that I'm going to ask Deborah to take the lead on, and it follows on from your comment, Mirette. The question is the Trump administration signaling interest in actually proceeding with negotiations, and do they have the bandwidth to take this on?
I think as you look at Middle East policy in this administration, there are very few areas where you're creating positive momentum. And I think trade is a very logical area to do that. And if we were working towards something positive like a free trade agreement, even if it took another 20 years, you're still at least negotiating towards something and building up those relations as opposed to being static, which tends to be negative. But with this administration, I don't think, having worked in several different administrations, they don't necessarily react in the same way that we had expectations that others have reacted. And USTR definitely has the bandwidth to take on something like this. There's no question.
They have?
They have. Of course. I mean, the China negotiations are a portion of this. Yes, they have a lot going on. The challenge with free trade agreements and the challenge with trying to maybe make certain concessions given the politics and the expediency is that you have to get them through the Hill. And trying to get the Hill to approve any kind of trade agreement these days is exceedingly difficult. And everybody wants to have it as a Christmas tree with their own issues. And they tend, as we've seen, to go from just being about trade to now they're being about labor issues. We haven't talked about the environmental issues. This administration, even though they've had a different policy, had still made sure that the environmental issues, for example, are in NAFTA and CAFTA. And so I think even if this administration were to start, and I would hope, and in many ways, it's for people like you, USTR, the administrations react to what American business wants. And if American business is saying this is a necessity and we see this as a priority, USTR can start that. But we're at the end of this administration, so even if we started tomorrow, this agreement is not going to be finished within the Trump administration. And then the question is, would the next administration want to take it on? Certainly we would hope so, but if you look at the candidates, again, they're not all people who are pro-trade and pro these kinds of agreements. So I think the politics, unfortunately, are against, the domestic politics here are maybe against being optimistic about getting an FTA started.
Can I ask, and this is a kind of an important question, because we started the conversation, and Mirette's thesis going forward is that there is increased interest in both the U.S. and in Egypt in doing an FTA. Your comment was that with increasing questions here in the United States about some of the global agreements like WTO, there's more interest, at least in the administration, in pursuing bilateral arrangements. But we also see, if we're just looking at the campaign statements, that on both the Democratic side and on the Republican side, there are real questions these days about the impact of some of these global trade agreements on U.S. employment, on U.S. economic development. Do you believe that that there is scope still for achieving bilateral trade agreements that can satisfy the Congress and can actually be implemented?
Is that a question for Mirette?
That question is for you.
I'm always an optimist on these kinds of issues because I think ultimately when you look at USTR taking a leadership role, and we look back over the many years of the difficult negotiations we've had, whether it was China or in the 90s and 80s, it was with Japan. Ultimately, when there was leadership coming out of the administration, even when it was negotiating autos with Japan, which at the time was the big, huge, difficult issue, or our biggest trade fights are with Canada on Canadian softwood lumber, which we still fight over. When there's leadership and the leaders and the business community is there and the countries are working towards an agreement, I'm optimistic that they will see that it's in the best interest of both countries to pass it. And even though they may tweak it, it's possible to get an agreement. So I think if the support is there that the Egyptian government wants this, that the business community wants this, and they start talking to USTR and we get the process started, they can move towards getting an agreement that's acceptable.
If, right?
If.
Yeah. Look, the effect of a free trade agreement with Egypt on the United States economically, it's minimal. It's only good for medium-sized companies, as I said before, that would have opportunities to invest in Egypt and Africa and so on. But Egyptian exports to the United States, compared to imports from the U.S. to Egypt, is just a huge surplus for the United States. So there it's not. The importance for the leadership of the U.S. to do it is it's strategic, it's political. What does Egypt mean to the United States in the region? On the free trade agreement, I think it was Ross or USTR Representative Lehr had already said that we want to have an FTA in Africa. And they looked at South Africa, they looked at Ethiopia, they looked at Uganda, hopefully Egypt. I mean, as I said, we are in Africa. So if they have to make a choice, for me it's obvious, but there are other considerations. So as Deborah says, it's a leadership decision. Who in the Egyptian government wants it, we still don't know. President Sisi has said in one of our meetings with the U.S. Chamber in New York, a company did ask him, "Are you for a free trade agreement with the United States?" He says, "Yeah, go for it." Okay, that usually means go for it. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, let me stay with you, Hisham, and we have another question from the audience. You've mentioned there are still a number of reforms for Egypt to meet FTA standards for the U.S. Can USAID programs in reforming Egyptian business be an avenue to achieve this?
Yes and no. I mean, look, USAID, since 1978, USAID has given $30 billion to Egypt. And I will say it's time for U.S. companies to reap the benefit of that. USAID has, very good programs and so on, but the amount of USAID money for Egypt has gone down from 800 to 125. So there's not a lot. There is. I mean, it's a lot, but it's not great. But I think there's so much reform to be done. I mean, as we've just said, Egypt's done an incredible amount of macroeconomic reform, stability, infrastructure, roads, ports. It's, you know, the renewable energy park in Aswan and Bin Ban. It's going to be what is the largest solar park in the world, and it's all private sector. And EBRD, European Bank, IFC, they've all contributed by equity and loans and so on. But no U.S. company. Nobody from the U.S. is part of this. Why? It's annoying. All right. Why is Egypt building a nuclear power plant with Russia? Where's Exim Bank? It's coming back, but where was it? Where was it? And American companies do have a disadvantage when it, you know, with all the big projects that are going on in Egypt because of financing. Siemens is building the 2-3 largest power plants in the world, but they come in with financing. GE is going crazy, but at last they've done something, but they got some locomotives or stuff. But you know, there needs to be a lot of reform still in Egypt. We've done all the macro, fiscal, and so on. There are problems, social problems, but the biggest problem that we are fighting in Egypt is the bureaucracy. Institutions have to be reformed, and you know, U.S. can help with that. But that's, you know, that is I think now a target for the Egyptian government to work on.
That's a deep integration FTA.
Right?
That's a deep integration
Exactly.
FTA. Need reform. Okay.
Well, Mirette, let me put this question from the audience to you. It says, military-affiliated companies tilt the playing field in Egypt, disadvantaging the private sector, as seen recently with the cement industry.
Mm-hmm.
Any reason to believe FTA talks would change that?
I don't think that's an issue for FTA talks. I think that's an issue for the Egyptian government and the military. Apart from the military, Egypt's public sector is about 22% of the market, which is huge. That needs to come down. I think the military needs to maybe rethink the way it does business in Egypt. I think they may be spreading themselves too thin. And I do think that there has been competition with the private sector that has probably disadvantaged the private sector. I don't think anyone in Egypt is going to make the case that the military should just disappear from the business side. I mean, they're the country's largest subcontractor, and I used to have someone say, well, when the military builds something, I mean, they deliver on time. But it does muddy the waters, it does bring profits down, and it does make investment, especially for external investments, unclear. So I do think that the military perhaps needs to rethink the way that it does business. There are some models. I mean, they have a bit of a boot model, if you like, in that they retain ownership role but hand over management. That's worked great. That works fine in tourism. Works fantastic in tourism because, you know, Hilton and Ritz and stuff, I mean, they don't own these properties, they want to run them. It works great in tourism. It does not work well in other things. I do think the military learned from the cement issue. It was not a big success, to put it bluntly. I do think they learned from the cement issue, and I do think that they need to rethink their business model. It's certainly for Egypt to grow at the rate that it needs to grow, that growth has got to be private sector driven and not public sector driven.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah,
I
please,
will
Deborah.
say, and we see this certainly in the context of China, where it's not the military, but it's the government. that the administration is looking very closely at state-owned enterprises, and state-owned enterprises definitely are permissible under the World Trade Organization. You know, France is very famous, but it becomes a procurement issue and competitiveness issue. And I think that is where, if the administration were looking at an FTA, or might be highlighting the role of the military or the government in the private sector, and just at least making sure that it's transparent and competitive.
Yeah, I think Deborah's right on the nose there, because one of the things required for an FTA is that the U.S. government will want access to procurement transparency. And the thing is, procurement transparency. And the thing is, Egypt is not a signatory or even an observer to that particular WTO convention. So it just, it's not that Egypt isn't doing it, it hasn't had to. So yes, someone is going to have to rethink those sidelines.
Well, I mean, fundamentally, I think that the issue is that the ability of a state-owned enterprise to compete against private sector tilts the playing field. I mean, it makes it disadvantageous for U.S. business to come in.
Yeah, I mean, it's competitive on profit, right? They usually get access to state capital. They worry about the profit, but not the loss. And the procurement system isn't always fair and open and transparent. And so these are, and I'm not saying that for Egypt, I'm just saying these are the issues that the administration is concerned, or the WTO even more broadly looks at and is concerned about.
So Hisham, in that context, do you think that Egyptian business, looking at the advantage of having an FTA with the United States, would see the opportunity to partner with U.S. companies as a way of strengthening the private sector and making it more competitive vis-a-vis the competition inside of Egypt?
Yeah. As I said before, the FTA will allow U.S. companies to look very seriously at Egypt. The private sector would love to have more joint ventures, more business affiliations, more representations, more import-export trade. Usually companies that invest I'm talking about Egypt. When they want to invest in Egypt, they start with a relationship, they start trading, they start exporting, they start seeing how their products are received, and then they start talking seriously about a joint venture or a more serious affiliation. So I think that's, and I think on the state-owned enterprises, Egypt has realized that they can't go on funding state-owned enterprises and making losses and so on. And we're still looking forward. There has been a commitment that's spearheaded by the new Minister Hisham Fahmy about selling, or not selling, that's the point, they don't sell. They'll put it on the market, they'll put it on the Egyptian Stock Exchange, and so on. Doing that is very complicated. Doing that has a lot of social and historical, you're gonna fire us all, what are you gonna do? So it's a complicated issue, but at least the government is thinking on the right track, that we can't just keep funding loss-making state-owned enterprises. And they're now looking at their assets and saying, why have you got hundreds of acres of land belonging to this state-owned enterprise that's doing nothing? Sell it, or even lease it, and so on. So there are a lot of discussions going on state-owned enterprises.
Go ahead.
If I could just comment to that. On privatization, there's more to privatization than putting up an IPO. I think what we've tended to do is very often have the IPO, retain minority interest, and keep the management. And traditionally speaking, Hisham will know more, but traditionally speaking, that has not worked out well. We need to have the IPOs, we need to change the management, they need to not retain minority interest. I mean, and if you want to retain the minority interest, that's fine. Retain the minority interest, but you need to change the management, and it's not just about that.
And a lot of private equity, a lot of private equity institutions around the world or companies around the world are really interested in Egyptian companies. And we've seen, and one of the successes that COS is the Egypt US Enterprise Fund. They started off with 300 million. They haven't spent the 300 million, but they've leveraged a lot. And they've come in, and I've seen them recently take positions in a lot of Egyptian companies and so on. And I've seen a lot of Egyptian companies expand in Africa, going back to Africa, and getting a lot of private equity people to support that. So it's all there. It just needs that big push.
Well, let me, if I may, let me go back. Deborah made the comment that state-owned enterprises often focus on profits but don't take into account losses. And one of the aspects of loss-making in state-owned enterprises is that they're often labor-intensive, if you will. That they often carry a much greater portion of employment than is justified by the economics of it. Presumably, if you have an economic sector, a private sector that's more focused on actually achieving sustainable economic performance, one of the aspects of that will be reducing redundancies in the labor force, and that can trigger social unrest. So how do you address that? As Egypt is trying to make this transition that you're talking about into a more private sector focused economy, how do you make that transition on the social impacts?
To me, that's me. That's me.
Whoever wants to take that one on.
Well, look, I think that's something that's is recognized, not only in the public sector companies. Look, we have 7 million government employees. Okay, why? Well, I know why, but so this is a big challenge, and the way to do it is to try and get those institutions, whether government or state enterprises, to become efficient. You take that organization and you see who are the people that are going to make it efficient and support it and so on. The others, you have many options. Either early retirement, give them a big amount of money that they can go and start their own business or whatever it is, excuse me, or stay home and we'll still pay you unemployment benefits. I mean, it's the same. I'm so sorry. There are very hard solutions, but I think the most important solution is to take whatever institution it is and make it efficient, make it run in a profit and loss situation. And if the labor is in the way, then find a solution for the labor. Make sure they don't just get fired, because that's you're asking for trouble. And we've seen that during the 2011 revolution and so on. Everything was crazy. So it's recognized, and I think the first part of the solution is recognizing the problem, and I think Egypt has recognized the problem.
Can I just add, I think to supplement that too, you have to energize the private sector, and so you have to be doing the kinds of things, I think, that support growth in other areas. So take the tech sector, as you were saying. We've worked with a fintech company that came from China. It's been a fascinating process in Egypt. One, it's Egypt starts to develop fintech, but why fintech will work in Egypt is the conditions are very similar to those in China. You have highly wired population, 100% plus mobile density, significant number of smartphones, and a large unbanked population that's cash-based society. That is ripe for fintech. But just like in China, it's very hard for the tech companies to, one, navigate the bureaucracy in Egypt, and for the small companies to get money. The growth of these private equity funds is terrific. Fahry has been a great success, right, which the Millennium Fund was an investor in. And there could be so many more of these kinds of companies. And then once you have that platform, it's amazing what happens, because you've seen just in the case Taobao with Alibaba has these things of Taobao villages in China. And you can create, now you're taking the internet and e-commerce to the countryside. So because people can be in, Anhui province in the middle of nowhere making watches, they can sell them on the internet. You have shipping companies, distribution companies, DHL, everybody now, the watch supply, parts, everybody is in that village with them. And it's all done over the internet. And so these provide all kinds of interesting opportunities. And with fintech, you can do loans in literally 1 minute with the kind of data that you have, just based on cell phone data. Who pays their bills, who doesn't. So you're all of a sudden getting microloans, you're creating the internet platform, and it can be transformational in a country like Egypt that has those kinds of conditions that may not exist, quite honestly, in other parts of Africa. So if the government can start to energize those kinds of things and bring those technology and support through policy and through financing, you can at least provide an alternative opportunity for some of those people who need to come out of the state-owned enterprises and the bureaucracy.
Can I ask you, Deborah, you have a vast experience with doing business with China. How do the Chinese see Egypt? I mean, what are the areas in Egypt that you think that China is very interested in exploiting?
I think there are several areas where, obviously they're looking at the sectors where they dominate, and I'm putting the state sector aside. All those agreements that you were talking about tend to be the really big infrastructure agreements, which are many years and very complicated. But for the Chinese private sector, new energy vehicles, I think this is going to be big opportunity in Egypt. And again, it's creating the infrastructure, the whole renewable energy, and the sustainable industry, not just solar and wind, but sustainability as a whole. There are so many opportunities, and China's technology that they develop tends to be, I should be representing USEgypt, but tends to be more suitable in a country like Egypt than, say, US technology, which can be a little more sophisticated and expensive sometimes. Finance through fintech, China now, nobody uses cash. Everything is on the mobile phone, and all the apps that go along with the mobile phone. So I think for China, but the challenges Chinese have found, and it's been really interesting, we hear from the Egyptian companies that Chinese products are cheap, inferior, shoddy, they're not reliable, they can't talk to them. And on the flip side, the Chinese say, well, it's not politically stable, it's very difficult to do business there. Again, it's similar to China, actually, but but it's both old bureaucracies. So you would think it would be actually a very natural fit, but it seems to be a very complicated one.
Mirette, you had started off in your opening comments talking about the development of Egypt as an energy hub, but not an energy exporter. Could you elaborate on that, and how do you see the that sector developing in Egypt going forward?
All right. Okay, so the recent, I say recent, starting in 2015, the recent finds in the Eastern Mediterranean have been a huge boon for Egypt. The Zohri field in the Eastern Mediterranean is the largest in the Eastern Mediterranean. And everybody in Egypt remembers after the uprisings, when our energy supplies were disrupted and factories were operating at 40 and 50% of their capacity. It was a nightmare. So those energy fines are, we have actually two things. The energy fines have been a boom in that they provide security and peace of mind. But it's likely that with Egypt's growing needs, a great deal of that is going to go to domestic use, not all of it domestic use. The other thing that Egypt did, which I thought was really smart, was set up the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which was 7 countries. I think it's Egypt, Israel, Greece, Italy, Jordan, Palestine, and Cyprus. All right. And they formed a forum to discuss pricing, exporting. So it's likely that Egypt, which has LNG plants, okay, and it's the only country in the region that has those LNG plants, will be a hub for that movement of gas. Egypt isn't massively interested in exporting huge quantities of gas. That's not where it's going. But it's more of a political boon, actually. It will make Egypt essential in that area for the movement and transport of that gas. It also provides extremely important political relationships with all of those countries. So it's, it was a very smart thing to do, and it's very efficient. But I don't think Egypt is looking to become a huge exporter of gas.
You brought up the energy hub and the East Mediterranean. And there are two things here that are so unbelievable to us as Egyptians. One of them is allowing the private sector to work in the oil and gas industry, to own, distribute, and so on. The second one is having the private sector import gas from Israel. And the deal has been signed for 19 billion. It was 15, now it's 19. Start in January. This, from people my age, is something unbelievable. And the political implications for that is huge and positive for the region, positive for our relationship with the United States. And as Mirette says, we will be exporting Israeli gas and Cyprus gas to Europe and I guess maybe Asia through, I don't know which way. But so the exports would come from other fields, either bring the Israeli gas and use it here in Egypt or exporting Egyptian gas. It depends which is closer and what are the commercial conditions. So I think, and then opening up the Red Sea for exploration, Exxon and Shell and so on are now looking at that. That could bring more, hopefully more energy into the system.
I wanted to ask about the Israeli angle. It has not been discussed very much. One would think that the relationship between Israel and Egypt, relatively positive these days, would be a competitive advantage for the Egyptians, that they would be able to, in some way, utilize a positive political relationship in order to promote greater economic investment. If I recall correctly, we had a QIZ between Egypt and Israel, and still have. How is that working, and is that an element of the FTA, or is that something that will eventually disappear, or whatever?
The QIZ has been working, has not been working as well as expected. Most of actually 95% of the products are textiles, because that's the high tariffs in the U.S. and that's what Egypt has, the cotton and the factories there. There are some other things like leather products and actually tin artichokes. But anyway, and it's grown 12% in the last year. So it's working, but the expectations were much bigger. As FTA and QIZ, I think we saw what happened in Jordan. Jordan had a QIZ and an FTA. It works both ways, but obviously FTA has the bigger impact.
Right.
So that's a good point. Everything that Hisham said about QIZ is great. My only thing is there has been a feeling.
Everything I say is great.
Everything you say normally is great. There has been a feeling. So on both sides of the water, if you like, in Egypt, the feeling is that there were higher hopes for the QIZ, but the QIZ, for some reason, is overwhelmingly textile-oriented. And I think the feeling was in Egypt, they said, well, once the Israelis realized that they had a captive market, they just drove the prices up, and therefore profits have dropped, even with the and in the US there is a feeling that Egypt isn't making enough use of the QIZs, and the QIZ is essentially a gift to Egypt. Actually, when I was doing the report, I actually got very good advice, and someone pointed out that it's very possible that if US consumers knew that this was sort of a result of a better relationship with Israel and involved Israeli goods, it might drive sales up, which it might. But there is a slight possibility that the QIZs might be a bit of an impediment to an FTA, in that there are US negotiators who say, well, make better use of the QIZ. The thing is, the QIZ is fantastic in some ways, but is going to be limited, and therefore in no way compensates for an FTA. So there's a slight complication there.
Deborah?
I just wanted to go back to actually another great thing that Hisham said.
It's your day, isn't it?
And that we didn't talk much about, but I think is a very, very strong argument for the FTA, and that is the issue of standards.
Yeah.
And it's a very concerning issue around the world that we see, where the US traditionally was the major standard setter in the world in any new technology that was coming out. And the fact that we see many countries not only adopting, obviously, European standards, but now adopting Chinese standards. And as we look at Egypt, and my boss, Hank Paulson, talks about something, the economic iron curtain, we see it playing out in places like Egypt. Huawei, for example. Most of Egypt's telecom infrastructure is based on Huawei technology. We have them on the entity and banned list. At some point down the road, you could envision a situation where the US government says, and we're saying this actually to the Europeans, we're not going to let you connect with us if your telecom system uses Huawei. And so in Europe, again, 80% of many of the European 4G networks are based on Huawei technology. They have two choices: rip it out or go and stick with Huawei and be banned by the US, because the Huawei technology that's going in the Egyptian telecom system is not operable with any other system. So to go to 5G, you have to use Huawei technology. That is, I think, a very strong both economic and national security reason why the US should be doing a free trade agreement and making sure it's US standards and US equipment that are being used.
This is a huge issue, and as you said quite correctly, it's an issue that goes well beyond Egypt and the FTA. I mean, this is something, and it's got serious national security implications for the US, because we're going to get to a point where our military is not going to be able to talk to our partner militaries anywhere in the world, and I think that this is an issue that is bubbling along under the surface that is going to be jumping up and biting us pretty soon.
And artificial intelligence, I mean, we see the major AI companies going into Egypt too. Facial recognition, obviously, it's very important when it comes to your phone, your banking system, but it can be used for so many other things.
Yeah, indeed. I have a question from the audience. It wasn't until April of 2019 that an ambassador to Egypt was nominated. I think that Jonathan is
Cohen.
confirmed,
Cohen.
right?
Yes.
Yeah, Jonathan Cohen. Does the panel believe that this is an indicator of U.S. interest in Egypt? I have an answer, but
I think obviously it was overdue. I mean, but it seemed that it wasn't only Egypt that didn't have an ambassador. I mean, does Saudi Arabia have one now? I don't know.
We have an ambassador in Saudi. We just confirmed one in the UAE. We don't have an ambassador in Qatar. We don't have an ambassador in Jordan.
Yeah, so
this is a broader
We're in
issue.
good company.
So now we have an ambassador, and I did have the chance to meet him and talk to him, and he's a wonderful person. He knows a lot. He was in the United Nations. He was acting for Nikki Haley after she left, and so on. He'll be going to Cairo in October, sort of middle, 20th of October, something like that. Tom Goldberger, who was the DCM in Egypt for a long time, did a fantastic job. We just gave him a farewell day before yesterday, and really he's done extremely well. He's appreciated by the Egyptian government. He's been appreciated by the private sector, by AmCham, by the U.S. Chamber, and we were lucky to have somebody to hold the fort until the new ambassador comes. And yes, I hope that that's an indication of interest in Egypt. Yeah.
Great. We're coming to the end of our time, so wanted to give all of our panelists an opportunity to make their final arguments, and for or against FTAs and the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. Mirette, maybe we should start with you.
I think it's a good idea, but that's. I think it's. I think it's due. I think it would be mutually. I don't see why people would not be pushing forward on this. I think it's mutually beneficial, if done properly, if done with a deep integration FTA. Right? And there are signs that Egypt is willing to move. Egypt already said, for example, it's willing to adopt double standards on autos, for example. Standards on autos have been a huge sticking point because US standards are not the same as EU standards, and Egypt has said that it is willing to do that. For example, as just one example, so they are willing to move. And there are definitely for Egypt's growth. I mean, if we look at Morocco, for example, after the Moroccan FTA. The Moroccan FTA cleared up labor issues that had been rankling for over 2 decades. All right, they did them on their own. They wanted the FTA. They did them on their own. Worked out great. There are enormous advantages for Egypt. There are myriad advantages for the U.S., mostly for U.S. businesses, because as Hisham noticed, it's not an equal relationship. The U.S. economy is not going to tip over if it doesn't do this. But there is an opportunity cost, and it's about more than the money. It's about the money, it's about the relationship, and it's about, honestly, ceding space in the Middle East to others, because that is a significant consideration, whether the U.S. wishes to cede space to the Russians, the Europeans, the Chinese. So I think it's, obviously the U.S. administration is preoccupied at the moment, but I do think that it is a good time to move forward. Could be mutually advantageous if done properly.
I think it's overwhelmingly positive for the United States, both economically and politically, and should absolutely move forward.
For the U.S. and for Egyptian companies, I think it's something that would be good. I'd just like to add that there's so much going on in Egypt at the moment, especially economically, that needs to be told, and that the U.S. government needs to be on board and pushing for more trade agreements.
Great, thank you. And that's the last word. Again, please do download Mirette's report, Trade Reform and Revitalization toward a U.S.-Egypt Free Trade Agreement. It's at www.mei.edu online for free. So please join me in thanking a great panel for their comments.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for coming out this morning.